Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Tech Forum session. I'm Madeline Griggs, software developer at BookNet Canada. Welcome to The Difference Queer Fanfiction Makes, Lessons for the Publishing Industry. Before we get started, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all lands that we are on today, an acknowledgement that is deeply personal due to this virtual platform and the wide range of locations people are joining us from today. Today, I'm broadcasting from the traditional territories of the original nations of this land, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. I encourage you to visit native-land.ca website to learn more about the peoples whose lands you are joining us from today. BookNet Canada endorses the calls to action from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada and supports an ongoing shift from gatekeeping to space making in the book industry. In the spirit of that acknowledgement, I confirm our responsibility in mending the sacred hoop within Canada's Indigenous peoples, to be an ally to all Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and to unite and work alongside one another. If you are having difficulties with Zoom or have any tech-related questions, please direct your questions to the tech support in the chat. You can find this option by using the drop-down menu above the chat box, or you can email techforum@booknetcanada.ca. We're providing live ASL and closed captioning for this presentation. To see the captions, please find the live transcript button in the Zoom menu at the bottom of your screen. Click on it and choose Show Subtitle. If, during the presentation, you have questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A panel found in the bottom menu. Lastly, we'd like to remind attendees of the Code of Conduct. Please do be kind, be inclusive, be respectful of others, including of their privacy, be aware of your words and actions, and please report any violations to techforum@booknetcanada.ca. Do not harass speakers, hosts, or attendees or record these sessions. We have a zero tolerance policy. You can find the entire Code of Conduct at techforum.booknetcanada.ca/code of conduct. Now let me introduce our speakers. Nikoo Sarraf recently graduated from McGill University with a BA in Computer Science and Hispanic Studies, and she is currently living in Montreal and pursuing her MA in Digital Humanities. She spent her last year working in the txtlab analyzing the textual and stylistic markers of queer fanfiction. Her other interests include social media and cultural analytics, music, and text mining. Jennifer Chen is a second-year B-Science student at McGill who is planning to major in computer science. Originally from Richmond Hill, Ontario, she is now living in Montreal, where she conducted data science research at txtlab McGill on fanfiction as a powerful and transformative form of writing, especially for LGBTQ+ youth. Jennifer is also passionate about philosophy, front-end engineering, and software design. And now I'll hand it over to them.
Hi, before we begin today, I'm just gonna try to share my screen and you guys let me know if you can see the PowerPoint right now. Yes? All right, yeah. Perfect.
Perfect. Okay, so welcome everyone. Our names are Nikoo Sarraf and Jennifer Chen. Thank you so much to BookNet Canada for having us. We are from txtlab at McGill University, and today's presentation will be on the nature of queer fanfiction. This is a project that we did in the lab about a year ago under Professor Andrew Piper. txtlab is an analytics lab where we use the quantitative tools of data science to study literature and culture. The projects in the lab have had a particular interest in questions of inclusivity and access, and figuring out the ways to overcome biases that occur in contemporary society. With this project specifically, our aim is to understand what makes fan fiction so powerful and transformative, especially for young queer readers.
So some of you may be wondering, why fan fiction in particular? Well, essentially, fan fiction is an incredibly powerful and transformative type of writing that provides a safe space for youth to explore their gender and sexuality. The incredibly large fan bases for fan fiction enable LGBTQ+ adolescents to feel part of a larger community that may be otherwise difficult to find in a heteronormative society. Researchers have also discovered that fanfiction is useful to sexual and gender minority youth, or SGMYs. Not only does fanfiction provide a sense of belonging, it is also crucial to helping young readers come to terms with their own sexuality. Statistics show that being exposed to a community where they're able to safely explore their identities, fanfiction participating youth are more active online daily and reach established identity milestones earlier than non-fandom participating peers. For example, one fanfic reader expressed in an interview that, "Without fandom, I wouldn't have found who I was." Our work builds on previous research done by fanfiction academics such as Dan Fielding, Diana Flogel, and others. In Dan Fielding's paper, he presents and works towards a definition of queer normativity, which is a principle that gives power to queer actors to define the normative. Fielding actively attempts to break down and reposition the traditional definition of normative. Fielding focuses his research on the social justice fandom space, a space where fan producers are consciously and intentionally writing queer stories to change their social world. In Diana Flogel's work, she examines how queer fan fiction writers reconfigure heteronormative narratives to create queer information worlds. Flogel constructed the concept of world queering, which is an exercise practiced in fanfiction writing in which the authors reorient content to be more in line with LGBTQ+ identities and to fill in the gaps that they find in traditional media. This concept of a queer information world is one that we will be returning to throughout this presentation.
Based on the findings of previous scholars, we sought to understand what it is about fan fiction that makes the practice of writing and reading it so incredibly transformative. Rather than examining the practice from a sociological perspective, we came at it from a quantitative angle, wanting to understand the stylistic qualities of fan fiction that might be contributing to strong reader attachments. By comparing queer fanfic with books published in more mainstream or corporate venues, we want to surface some of the properties of fanfic that distinguish it from the mainstream. We use data-driven methods in order to provide empirical support for existing findings. In this project, we're asking questions like, what literary characteristics differentiate fan fiction from mainstream fiction? How do those distinctions potentially make a difference in the effect that these texts have on readers, especially with respect to their identity formation? What potential effects does the greater emphasis on intimacy and sex have for sexual and gender minorities? Is fan fiction more character-driven in comparison to the more plot-driven narrative style adopted by conventional literature? Do fanfic authors feel more comfortable exploring vulnerable topics? And how does the range of emotion explored in fan fiction compare to that of mainstream books?
So you may have seen this slide of terminology circulating before our presentation, but just to quickly go over them again. First, we have SGMY, which stands for Sexual and Gender Minority Youth. A tool we use pretty often is Natural Language Toolkit, or NLTK, which is a platform for building Python programs. Stop words are words that tend to have little substance, such as the, and, but, or, and, etc., etc. A corpus is a collection of written text. So if we say the fanfiction corpus, this means all of the fanfiction texts that we studied. Lematization refers to the grouping of all forms of a word so they can be analyzed as a single item. For example, drink, drinking, drank would all be classified under drink. So bigrams and trigrams refers to groups of 2 or 3 words. For our case, a bigram contains a subject-verb pair, and a trigram consists of a subject-verb-object trigram. Finally, bootstrap sampling is a research method that involves repeatedly drawing a sample of data from a larger collection of texts in our cases. So for our project, we compared 2 data sets against each other. The fanfiction data that we used was drawn from Archive of Our Own, which is a repository similar to Wattpad. This set includes almost 14,000 randomly selected texts drawn equally from the top 15 fandoms on the site as of 2019 that were explicitly tagged as queer. Our second data set consisted of 426 novels that were reviewed in the New York Times since 2002. So the New York Times data set approximates popular mainstream literary fiction. We divided our research questions into 3 sections, which are listed here and include the exploration of taboo topics, character-focused storytelling, and emotional vulnerability.
So going in order, first, we are going to discuss our exploration into taboo topics. Given the audience for queer fanfiction, we hypothesize that fanfiction authors will be more open to using more taboo language, such as profanity or sex-related vocabulary. To test this theory, one form of analysis that we employed was a topic model that clusters together various words that belong to the same topic. Then we found the likelihood of that topic occurring in both of our data sets, fanfiction and New York Times. Both of our corpuses were split into 500-word text segments to account for the length differences between an average fanfiction story and an average novel. The aim of the topic model is to investigate disproportionate interest in subject matter in one or the other data set. We found that it was immediately noticeable that fanfiction writers are much more comfortable exploring certain topics which tend to be like, quote, off limits to mainstream fiction authors. The first method of analysis involved using a topic model to search for recurring themes that emerge distinctively in one data set, but not in the other. Several software libraries were employed in this process. To begin, we used Python's NLTK to filter out stop words, and we used Spacy to lematize the corpus, and to make sure that all different forms of words were grouped under one common base form. So then we used a dictionary of words to create a bag of words corpus, and we ended up with a term topic matrix with each column containing 20 words belonging to a given topic. So what you see on the screen right now is our resulting term topic matrix. It's just a snippet of it, so you can't see all 40 of the topics, but basically across the top, you will get all 40 topics, and inside each one is the top 20 words that occur in each of those topics.
So the next step was to get the probability of a given topic occurring in either one of the data sets. So to do this, we stored the topic distribution for all the documents in our data set and then ran 1,000 bootstrap samples per data set to get the average topic probability for both the fanfiction and mainstream fiction data sets. To help us better visualize this spreadsheet data, we created a graph to visually display which topics are more disproportionately represented in either dataset. So on the left, you see the topics that are most disproportionately favored by the fanfiction dataset. And as you move towards the right, we start encountering the topics that are more and more disproportionately represented in the New York Times dataset. Evidently, as you can see within this graph, the topics that are most disproportionately favored by fanfiction are related to sex, emotions, and observation, while the topics more prevalent in mainstream fiction concern family and career life. A lot of intimate topics such as observation, pain, crying, and the body are far more frequently mentioned in the fanfiction corpus. In particular, there seems to be a heavy emphasis on intimacy and body language in the fanfictions that is absent from mainstream fiction. And this creates a space where queerness is normalized and expansively explored. It is important to point out that such intimacy is not only based on sexual contact, but it crucially encompasses a broad range of emotions as well. The published mainstream fiction is distinguished by its attention to more traditional public-facing activities, such as school, work, and family. this attention to social spaces in mainstream fiction has the effect of maintaining the typical social taboos around the forms of human intimacy and sex.
So here we have some of our main takeaways from our exploration of taboo topics, showing that we were right in our hypothesis that fanfiction writers spend more time writing about taboo topics than mainstream writers do. To give a statistic from our work, fanfic is about 6 times more likely to write about sex and 3 times more likely to write about intimate emotions than mainstream fiction. The results of our topic modeling work were particularly enlightening with respect to the subject matter covered in the 2 corpuses. When looking at the results, it was immediately noticeable that there is a discrepancy in the subject matter covered by the authors of fanfic and the authors of mainstream texts. While we, of course, don't know with certainty why those mainstream authors rarely broach certain topics, and we don't mean to imply that they don't want to discuss certain topics, there could be many reasons for this. Perhaps there are limitations in corporate publishing or restrictions on the type of language that authors are able to use in order to appeal to certain audiences. Another possibility could be that fanfiction writers are writing for a small group of readers who have already demonstrated an interest in a specific subject matter. In any case, it is evident that based on the results of the topic model, it's clear that fanfiction authors delve further into certain subject matter than popular fiction authors do. This section also shows, as posited by Dan Fielding and other researchers, that fanfiction aims to fill the gaps left in mainstream media, specifically themes of intimacy and sex. As Fielding discovers through his work, engaging with this fanfiction material gives fans a space to disidentify with the norms and celebrate queer narratives. We also found that these results confirm that fanfiction presents a distinct queer information world, in this case, one that consists of exploring sexuality, intimacy, vulnerability, which strongly differentiates it from mainstream fiction.
A lot of these ideas also come up in our second area of focus, which is charactercentrism. We initially hypothesized that fanfiction would emphasize character relationships, resulting in stories that are more character-driven rather than plot-driven. This is because fanfiction is premised on an engagement with existing characters and redeploying them in novel narrative settings. In a survey conducted in the Harry Potter fanfiction community, it was evident that in the hierarchy of textual elements in fanfiction, characters were placed first, followed by world building and plot. In order to test this theory, we used David Bamman's book NLP library to obtain tables that provide data about every word in every corpus. So what you are looking at right now is a sample tokens file. And what this shows is how every single word in the text is given its own row in the file, and it comes with a lot of additional information and data about every word that makes it much easier to analyze the text. For example, this tokens file provides us with the lemmatized form of the word, the part of speech that the word belongs to, and many other markers and IDs. In order to find the character-centric words, we filtered on 2 factors. First, we collected all of the words with an NER tag person. Additionally, we collected any entry that had she, he, or they in the lemma column. Finally, what we wanted to do was we wanted to calculate the ratio of character-centric words to all words within the text. So we did this by essentially just summing up the number of character-centric words, then dividing by the total number of non-punctuation tokens.
Doing so, we found that queer fanfiction is more character-centric than conventional literature. According to our test, about 8.7% of the words in the New York Times books are character-centric, and about 9.9% of the words in fanfic are character-centric. This may seem like an inconsequential difference, but this equates to about 1,200 more character mentions in a novel-length book. This data suggests that mainstream fiction centers more strongly around plot lines or events in which characters are interacting with their immediate environments, while queer fanfiction tends to revolve more around interpersonal experiences. Since fan fictions take place in worlds that have already been built by authors, there's less focus on world building and more focus on character building. This is important for young queer individuals as it normalizes queerness and presents more queer characters and relationships that young fans can relate to and learn from. As shown by previous work in this field, young queer fans rely on fan fiction to connect and identify with their identities earlier in life. What makes fan fiction unique is that it takes characters that readers already feel some degree of connection to, and then adds more depth and variation to these pre-existing relationships to connect them more deeply with readers who are seeking out less visible forms of human connection. Through the fan fiction, the fans can read and write about their favorite characters, exploring a level of emotional depth that they wish they would have seen explored in the original work, or explore a relationship between two characters that they would have liked to see play out in the original. This is another example of Diana Flogel's world queering, or writing the story you want to read, which is the title of her piece on this topic.
So one final style difference we wanted to investigate is the frequency of discussion of emotional vulnerability within the two data sets. Our preliminary research suggests that the connections formed by SGMYs and their fanfiction worlds are extremely personal and are strengthened by feelings of belonging and acceptance. We sought to discover if SGMYs are drawn to fanfiction because the subject matter is distinctively designed to connect with readers on a deeper emotional level. This is where our narrative event analysis comes into play. For our purposes, we define an event as an action undertaken by an agent. Using the Book NLP tool, we began by parsing through our tokens files and collecting bigrams of the form subject-verb and trigrams of the form subject-verb-object, where these connections are derived from their dependency relationships. So this slide shows the bigrams that have been extracted from a text segment, as well as some trigrams as well. On the left side, you see the original text that has been stripped of punctuation marks. On the right side, we see the text transformed into bigrams and trigrams. So in order to begin our analysis, we took these bigrams and trigrams from the image on the right, and we resolved all subjects to a single superordinate category, person. So this may include both pronouns and proper names. So for example, Johnny walk would become person walk. Then to only focus on the more common events, since there are many events that only occur once in the entire corpus, we only kept the 1,000 most frequently parsed narrative events and removed the rest. We then also ran a second analysis where we categorized events by their Book NLP supersense, which aggregates verbs and objects into broader categories. So for example, person say would become person verb communicate, and person role I would become person verb motion noun body. So this helps us look at larger trends within the nouns and verb pairs rather than just the bigrams and trigrams themselves, to have a more general look at what kinds of events are occurring. Finally, we then used a log likelihood ratio test, otherwise known as a G-test, to calculate the events that are more significantly likely to appear in one data set relative to the other. After running some of these steps, we arrived at something that looks like this, which is our final table of outputs. In this table, you can see the subject, verb, and object of every single sentence, as well as the supersense.
To make sense of all of the technical steps that Jen just outlined, we're going to present some graphs that we made that show the events that are most distinctive of each corpus. So this first graph is showing the narrative events commonly occurring in mainstream fiction, but not in fan fiction. As you can see, these events are absent of words that suggest emotional vulnerability, and instead they describe common events that are performed in everyday activities. Many are also career or family oriented, such as working, marrying, and having money. This graph shows the events that are most skewed towards the fanfiction data set. And as you can see, these events hone in on introspective feelings. So persons sigh, smile, smirk. And in our next graph, you can see that it's the same thing, but these are the supersense events, which means that all instances of, for example, the events that you saw in the previous graph, persons sigh, smile, smirk, groan, were all aggregated into one event called person, verb, body. These actions all communicate emotion from one character to another. And furthermore, some of the fanfiction skewed events also have sexual undertones, such as person lick lip or person moan. This conveyance of intimacy is another demonstration of vulnerability. And finally, here you can see these events are much more common and having to do with career or family or just everyday activities, such as person, possess, artifact, person, verb, stative, person, and so on.
So in a sense, fanfiction explores a lot of the topics that are absent from other forms of contemporary culture. And this creates a space where the discussion of sexuality is desired rather than stigmatized. The prevalence of narrative events that encourage and celebrate the expression of self illustrates the manner in which fanfiction normalizes intimacy and emotional vulnerabilities for sexual and gender minority youth. This is demonstrated through the patterns that emerge in the words from the topic model of the two datasets that we have just been looking at. Even from just looking at the words that are most skewed towards either one of the corpuses, it is clear that there is an abundance of emotionally charged vocabulary present in the fanfictions. On the other hand, mainstream fiction indicates an interest in traditional public-facing social institutions, such as businesses, families, careers, and this is indicated with words such as lawyer, police, and soldier. Fanfiction draws greater attention instead to issues of personal interaction and feeling, and rather than reinforcing public norms, its aim is to provide alternative spaces that are not well represented in the mainstream world. Not only is it important to cover these topics in queer fanfiction in order to provide representation to young readers, it also helps to normalize them within the queer context. Showing the vulnerable side of characters constructs a layer of realism within the narratives that helps the queer information world feel familiar for SGMYs. By reading about the feelings and internal thoughts of reconstructed characters, a sense of reliability is created for sexual and gender minority youth. A qualitative observation that Nikoo and I noted is that, in relation to feelings' idea of queer normativity, the high degree of intimate communication between fanfiction readers normalizes feelings of insecurity, sadness, and vulnerability, especially for youth.
Based on the previous literature published on the subject of queer fanfiction, it's very clear that there is a specific draw towards fanfiction among young queer people. Previous research suggests that fanfiction communities provide unique feelings of belonging and support and a safe place for young readers to explore their identities. Our work corroborates the claims put forth by the previously mentioned authors and offers more analytical insight into the works of fanfiction themselves. Our data suggests that fanfiction writers are creating a separate world for the LGBTQ+ community. The fanfiction medium itself is unique in the sense that it often builds off of worlds that are already fictitious. The fanfictions thus further explore topics that are absent from traditional media, such as more intimate forms of romance or interactions where already well-known characters open up about their insecurities and vulnerabilities. Thus, rather than attempting to inject queer normativity into the world, fanfiction creates distinctively unique worlds where activities such as family life, career, and school are far less prevalent. Instead, fanfiction creates a community that validates and normalizes the sexual and emotionally sensitive experiences that are unique to SGMYs. Honing in on these experiences is useful to readers in their formative years because they can see themselves in the stories and read about themes which are lacking in the mainstream fiction that they may be reading.
So our aim in analyzing key literary differences between fanfiction and mainstream fiction has been to complement and validate existing research using computational text analysis. We find that fanfiction represents a distinct queer information world as hypothesized by Diana Flogel, one that consists of the exploration of sexuality, intimacy, and vulnerability. As Dan Fielding's findings prove, young queer fans seek to find representation and view fanfiction as a way to combat the marginalization they feel as members of an often ostracized community. Our findings are important as they quantify some of the key differences between fanfiction and mainstream fiction, perhaps explaining why queer people specifically, more than any other group, are drawn to reading, writing, and engaging with fanfiction and online fandoms. So what does this mean for publishers? Well, there are a couple of key takeaways that can be drawn from our research presentation. First of all, we should keep an open mind about the fact that the presence of stigmatized topics in published literature is not necessarily bad. Enabling youth to learn about their feelings and sexualities is an important part for emotional growth. I think that there's an incredibly important distinction to be drawn between exposing adolescents to opportunities to learn about their sexualities and exposing adolescents to overly graphic texts. In particular, literature can be used as a tool for reducing stigma surrounding a lot of taboo topics. And as publishers, it's important that we keep this in mind, especially in the 21st century. So secondly, there appears to be a sizable market for LGBTQ fanfiction, yet a lack of publications that are actively being produced to fulfill this demand. As Nikoo mentioned, there seems to be a lot of readers who seem to want to read about characters that they can relate to, that they can see themselves in. And currently, a part of the reason why fanfiction is so popular among LGBTQ plus youth is because that this is absent within mainstream fiction, within things such as bookstores. Fielding's theory that there's a gap within the space of mainstream fiction is also supported by our research, and this gap is one that can be filled by publishers within the industry. Finally, we have to keep in mind that we should avoid the mindset that fanfiction writing is of lower grade than published work. After all, fanfiction writers deserve to have their work celebrated and brought to light as well. Even though we traditionally think of good fiction as work that may be, for example, original, as we have discussed, there are many benefits of writing fan fiction because it provides a opportunity for readers to develop a much deeper emotional connection with characters that they have previously already been exposed to in the original works. Diversity in the publishing world is absolutely necessary if we want to achieve complete queer normativity. So even though fanfiction is a space where this queer normativity exists, in most of our social domains, the norm is still completely defined around heterosexual relations. By publishing more works that have a more similar style to fanfiction and explores some of the topics that are prevalent within fanfictions that are currently absent from mainstream fiction, we're able to kind of move towards this direction of normalizing this queer information world. Already, Wattpad selects a story a year to be published, and this is something that I think is a trend that could have a lot of positive impacts on society as a whole.
Finally, we wanted to include some time for considering future research in this area. One particular question that we're interested in is whether the medium of fan fiction affects its popularity. Fanfiction is obviously web-based, and as we've seen from previous studies, provides a safe space for young readers. The fact that fanfiction websites are completely free and open for anyone to explore means that young consumers can read the diverse stories without having necessarily to ask an adult in their lives to purchase something for them. A study done by Shelley Craig and Lauren McEnroy found that fandom participants reported that they came out to an online friend before coming out to anyone in person. Reading fanfiction online provides consumers with an anonymity that is much more difficult to come by with mainstream texts. Of course, there are books that include diverse characters, but the act of physically purchasing and reading a book may feel too exposing for young readers. Additionally, how do the queer information worlds crafted by fanfiction authors differ from those created within mainstream published fictions that are also focusing on LGBTQ+ romances? And to what extent is the connection that SGMYs feel with fanfiction characters reliant on the fact that readers are already familiar with these characters? In other words, would our arguments still hold for informally published writing on sites such as Wattpad that are fully original? And would the authors still spend time world building or character building in that case?
So our analysis attempts to highlight the stylistic features of fanfiction that is supported by social science survey data related to fandoms. Our hope with this project is to help break down the stigmatization of fanfiction that comes from literary systems of value predicated on hierarchical social norms. Instead, we aspire to highlight some of the social values that creative work like fanfiction offers to the world. Thank you everyone for listening, and we would be more than happy to take any questions.
Hello there. I'm just trying to see if I can see everybody here. Great. So thank you very much for that wonderful presentation. We have a couple of questions here from the audience. The first one is actually in regard to a specific slide. It's in the Taboo's topics section. I think it was that the wonderful slide that you have that we talked a little bit about before. And the question is, what is the difference between communicating and communication on the x-axis there? Specifically, the difference between the New York Times and the fanfiction frequency?
Are we talking about this slide, or?
Yes, that's the
Okay.
correct one, I believe. There's you can see communicating right next to the sort of feeling spike, and then we have communication close to the opposite side, pictures and art, between pictures and art and writing.
Yeah. So the thing about topic modeling is that the outputs like group together the words, but they don't come up with the title of the category themselves. So as you can see here, like the topmost line that goes like family, phone, lifestyle, those were like we wrote in those
right, you selected the topics by the groupings of words. Okay.
Yeah, based on reading those words. And also we played around a bunch, experimented a bunch with how many topics seemed to be a good fit. We tried 20, 40, 60, 80, and we ended up going with 40 because if you go too many, like if we found that if we tried 60, we've got a lot of repeat topics.
Right.
And if we went to 20, we got a lot of like topics that words were put together that shouldn't really go together. It didn't really make sense. It wasn't very cohesive.
So that's one of the topics that you'd say would be a duplicate type of topic then?
Yeah, it's possible that it was a duplicate topic, or it was like one could have been like phone communication, like topic 2 over here, phone, call, number, message. And another one could have been like speak, talk.
Right, about methods of communication versus the physical action of talking to people. Okay, cool. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Another question we have is there an intention to recreate this research in any other languages? Have you been looking at fan fiction in French, in any other language?
We have not, but I would be interested to read if anyone would do it.
Yeah, I think that we definitely could, and I don't think it would be too particularly different in terms of the process. I think the reason that we stuck to English was just because, like just like the previous question where we're talking about how we have to label the topics ourselves, things like that would be more difficult in another language. But I definitely think a lot of the processes we use are applicable to other languages 100%.
Yeah, and all of the Python tools that we used as well can be done in other languages too. You just change
they're not specific to English.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. Another one we have is about the corpus of the fan fiction. Do you know what the distribution of one-shot works versus longer chaptered works, and were there any novel-length works present in the corpus for fan fiction? The person who is asking this question says that in their experience, the content of say sub 6,000 character work, or sorry, sub 6,000 word works tends to be more indulgent and character smuttier, fluffier, character focused works. And then the longer works would perhaps be more reflective of the New York Times data set.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting to know as well. So the length of the work that we use is basically proportional to like the lengths of the works that are present on AO3. So this does definitely mean that there are a lot of shorter works, just because we took like a sample of works from AO3 that had like basically the proportion that was like present on the site, if you know what I mean.
Yes, yeah, which is more heavily skewed towards one shots because physically it takes less time to write them.
Yeah, exactly. So that's definitely like a contributing factor as well to, why there could be a lot more of like these, sexual stories as well. People want something that's like quick to read, something like fast. And when you have like these shorter works, it definitely does contribute to that as well. So there definitely were some longer pieces that we used as well. But because of just the nature of the pieces that are present on fan fiction sites, they tended to be a lot shorter than the average length of a New York Times bestseller.
Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, so we can say that there are some longer works present, but in general, it's reflective of the website as a whole, which skews towards shorter works.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Great. So as a follow-up to that, some people are curious about how are you accounting for discrepancy in the word count between the fan fiction and the New York Times books as it relates to classifying content as character-driven specifically?
Yeah.
Oh, Nikoo, go ahead.
Yeah, I realized we mentioned this, but probably like too briefly. So obviously you can see that the average length of the texts there's a huge difference in them. So when we were processing them, every text was broken up into chunks of 500 words, and we did everything like chunk by chunk. So if that makes sense, like, so we were comparing texts of similar length at the code level, but obviously the overall length of a fanfiction text and a New York Times text is very
considerably different. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
so here's our data overview on the slide. So for things like charactercentrism, where we just kind of tabulate the number of character-centric words, we would divide by the total number of words in that corpus. So it's proportional to how many words are in that corpus, essentially. Yeah.
Okay. And then I have another question here, and I think I can tie two of these questions in together. One of the points was many of the points you raised in your slide are specifically about youth, and they were wondering if the books you looked at from the New York Times were young adult books or if they were just general adult fiction, nonfiction. And then as a follow-up to that, that I was personally wondering about is, have you considered doing any follow-up work related to the romance genre? Because you have selected for fan fiction as slash fiction, which would seem to be more romantically inclined. So two-parter. What about youth? What about romance?
Yeah. So the first one about the New York Times bestsellers. So we kind of just went with like more like we didn't specifically go for like youth like fiction, if that makes sense. I think
Yeah.
we just like looked a little bit more generally. Like I think only like certain texts are available online, and to get a large data set, there's a trade-off, right? Like if we want to have a really large data set of publicly available online texts, that means that we may have to look at more broader categories of things to get a really large corpus. So, but that's definitely something we, I don't know if I put that in like my research questions for future studies, like looking at different data sets and things like that. But I do think that there is a lot of value in only looking at fiction written for a very specific age group in particular. And the second question was
about comparing the same fan fiction data set to the romance genre specifically, although again, I'm sure that we have the same issue with getting a large enough data set together with that.
Yeah, I also think that very similar idea, where if we just look at romances, then we will probably have more topics such as sex and intimacy coming up. I think that but one thing I do think that wouldn't really change so much if we just filtered on romance is the like when we look at New York Times romances, at least from my experiences, 99% of them will just be like heterosexual relations, right? So I think that in terms of a lot of the conclusions that we've drawn specifically about queer youth, we still have that issue of not seeing that representation, whether we're looking at just romances or a broader category.
Okay, interesting. And then as a one follow-up question, or just general question. So you guys have spent a fair bit of time working on this. Do you think that working on this has changed how you read, or maybe how you look for what you read?
Nikoo?
It's a hard one to answer.
I know, it's a hard one to answer, and like it's hard to even find time to read when we're in school. But yeah, no, for sure, it's definitely, I think, made us, I mean, I'll speak for myself, made me like more aware as I'm reading. Yeah, and I mean, with our, like in our slide about, considerations for the publishing industry, it's definitely interesting to see like what books become super popular and like what themes they cover, and so yeah, to answer your question, yes, definitely.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it's made me a lot more aware of how the literature we read kind of shapes our perception of what normal looks like, right? Like, especially because like my family is like Chinese, but growing up I always like read like English books, and I think that really for me like skewed my perception of what normal looks like. And this applies as well for things such as like relationships, right? Like when people read books about like, oh, this is what a relationship should look like, it's like a male and a female and they go through like these things, it is a little bit detrimental to young people growing up, seeing that what they are kind of like looking for in a relationship, or what they experience growing up is different from what they are reading about. And I think that doing this research project has made me a lot more aware of that, like the way I've kind of realized that how my perception of what is normal is largely dependent on the media that I'm consuming growing up, right? And this applies for television and things like that as well. So I think that this has definitely affected me in that way.
Right, making you more aware of how that's affected you. That's really interesting. We have a couple more questions here from the audience. One of them is, can you speculate a bit on how the age of the authors, which is apparently not trackable on AO3, that makes sense, and how that might contribute to the use of taboo topics in content written for a youth age grouping?
Yeah, this is interesting. This is something that I talked to Dr. Piper about, our professor who oversaw this project. This is something I asked him about like when we first started, was if we could get any data on the authors of the fan fictions, but it is really hard to get like any of that personal information from AO3, basically, unless the author themselves wants to like put
out
it
themselves,
in their bio or something. Yeah, so we ended up like not considering it at all, but it is interesting to think about, because I do think like based on what we have read and what we know about the audience for fan fiction. I'm sure that most of the writers are also in that same demographic, being like mostly young. I think we read a study that had like the age, it was like between like 17 and 25. I could be getting that wrong, but something. And then like the gender identity was mostly female, and then actually like non-binary or something else, and then like male was last.
That's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about.
And then we had one follow-up question. It's not necessarily about data, but they're curious about your thoughts about moving fan fiction into mainstream publishing. Specifically, they're thinking about rights issues that might arrive, about publishing stories about existing intellectual property. I think that one's a pretty interesting question, especially when we're talking about fan fictions that are about characters but set in alternate universes.
Yeah, that's definitely, something that I've been thinking about recently as well, like working on this this particular research presentation is, like we want to say that, oh, like there's a lot of benefits of, moving fan fiction into a more mainstream venue, but is that really possible with, the original authors? Like, would they be on board with that and things like that? So I of course I don't know specific things about like copyright and stuff like that, but what I do think is that like say if I was an author and there were fan fictions written about the work that characters that like I've created in the past, I think that like bringing these fan fictions into the mainstream world is actually going to probably have a lot of public like good positive publicity and actually gain more traction for more readers for my work, right? Like if
like the original work gets a boost from the fan fiction becoming popular.
Exactly,
I can see that. Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that the same way that a movie for a book would be really beneficial to like the original author. I think this is kind of like a similar idea, right? You're creating a twist on something, and I think that this is something that maybe people can work with the original authors to kind of figure out a way that is mutually beneficial for both parties.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I feel like that situation of fan fiction being published openly as a fan fiction, I've never heard of that happening. There's been some ones like, say, City of Bones, which is probably closest to what we want to talk about now. It was originally a Harry Potter fan fiction, and then it got significantly reworked, and it became a mainstream fiction after that. But that was, again, it was a situation of an alternate universe setting that the author had created, reusing characters. Or 50 Shades of Grey, another one that was an alternate universe using characters from an existing work. But I've never heard of anyone being just an open fan fiction.
Yeah, maybe we'll get there one day.
And then as a last one, for the top fandoms, were they drawn from different mediums? Like, were they mostly from books, or were they from a combination of, books, anime, TV shows, movies?
Yeah, definitely a combination. Yeah, we had like Naruto, which is like an anime. We had, I think Sherlock Holmes, I was surprised, but that was apparently one of the top 15. So that's like a, TV series. And then a lot were books, so like Harry Potter and like stuff like that. So we definitely had a mix there. Yeah.
Right, interesting. Did you notice about the if the originating culture of the canon works had an effect on the types of tags or queer themes or relationships?
I, like when Nikoo and I were like reading through some of the fan fictions ourselves, we really think that there was a lot of creative liberty that was taken. There wasn't too much of an impact on, what the original relationships and stuff and things like that from the original works look like. The authors are honestly very, very creative with what sorts of relationships, that new relationships between characters that they come up with that, are basically have nothing to do with like the canon. So from my experiences reading, I don't know if Nikoo, you feel the same. I feel like there was just a lot of creative liberty being taken.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and the fandoms, I mean, like Jen said, were very diverse. I believe One Direction was even one of the top fandoms.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. So
Maybe BTS is on there too.
Yeah, maybe.
I think that's pretty interesting. So it shows that there's a willingness for the fan fiction reading audience to accept really wide divergence from the original canon, as long as it fits what they want.
Definitely.
That's cool.
Yeah.
All right. And I think we may have gotten through, we have one last question, I think, and we have the time, I think. Any thoughts on the difference between the content and style of really popular works on AO3? Like, you know, very kudoed, very followed works versus just the average quality fan work on that website. When it comes to like establishing queer norms or differences between those types of works that you see?
Yeah. This is something that we didn't pay too much attention to. So the stories were pulled from highly popular fandoms, but the stories themselves were not necessarily like they didn't necessarily have a lot of like kudos or reviews or anything. So
they were just averaged. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I think that would be definitely an interesting thing to explore,
Yeah.
like language differences between average fan fiction works versus the works that are getting filtered to the top via the kudo system.
I agree as well. Yeah.
Cool. I think we've gotten all of our questions finished up. So thank you so much, Jennifer and Nikoo, for this insightful presentation. Before we go, I'd love it if you could provide feedback on this session. We'll drop a link to the survey in the chat. Please take a couple minutes to fill it out. We'll also be emailing you a link to a recording of this session as soon as it's available. Lastly, we'd like to thank the Department of Canadian Heritage for their support through the BookNet Canada Book Fund. And thank you all for attending. All right, thank you very much, everybody. See you later.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks.